Hello everyone, we are in our final module for the class, which is Module 6, and we'll be covering the last two chapters of the text, which include Chapter 11, Groups and Individuals, as well as Chapter 12, Adversity and Happiness. So let's go through the agenda really quickly. You'll see here your normal sort of to-do list. I just want to make sure to point out the last exam is going to be due by Friday, 11:59 p.m. So don't miss out on that. Your chapter objectives, here we have the chapter on groups and individuals. And this is really nicely placed towards the end of the book because now at this point you have a good firm knowledge of all the different components that go into social thought and social action. And we've talked about conformity, we've talked about aggression, we've talked about prosocial behavior, social perception, social cognition. Now we start to really parse out who are we when we're in a group and who are we when we're an individual. So the text is going to start with defining what groups are and how groups run according to the various roles, status, norms, cohesiveness, and so forth. You're going to see some concepts come back up, especially from the social cognition chapter, and even the things that we covered in the social influence area when we talked about like Milgram study and we talked about Ash's conformity studies. You're going to see how some of that pops up again when we start talking about groups and how being in a group changes our behavior due to various factors involved and different variables involved when we get into a group of people. But you'll start to see that there are certain aspects of the group that matter. So it can't just be any old group. The type of group that we're talking about also influences how we're going to behave, how big the group is, how notable the group is, or how much the person wants in the group. Is there a price to joining? Is there a certain status to being in the group? All of those things factor in and play a role in how much influence that group's going to have over us and our behaviors. And when we're in a group, there's usually roles that are involved. You know, not everyone in a group plays the same role. You know, this happens at work, this happens at school, this happens in a family. Everybody has a role to play. If everyone did everything, it just wouldn't work. So the role that we play also can dictate behavior. We act differently then when we're in front of other people. When we have an audience, we perform differently. So we'll get into a little bit of the work in social facilitation. What settings actually bring out the best in us versus the worst? When do we perform well versus perform poorly? And what factors contribute to that? And that gets also into social loafing. And then what happens when we hide in the group? This is the concept of de-individuation. When the group masks our own personal identity and we're not seen as an individual, but we're only seen as part of the group, that has some very negative consequences. And so that will be discussed a little bit. We'll get into also a little bit of conflict, cooperation, some different areas that we kind of touched on a little bit in the aggression chapter, but a little bit more so here in terms of what's going on when we have to deal with different personalities and different people within a group setting. You know, how do we manage that, those different roles and the conflict that can ensue because of them? And this gets into the dynamics of different social dilemmas. So the book will talk a little bit more about that. Also some interesting work on cooperation and conflict resolution also comes up in this chapter, as well as you'll see down below in the adversity chapter. We'll get into some more of that too. We'll also get into some different aspects of the group that talk a little bit more about, what can groups do for us, what benefits do groups have, so costs and benefits to being in a group. And then it ends sort of with more of the negative sorts of consequences of groups, like what happens when groups make decisions. We get into this concept of groupthink, which can happen in many domains. Just for a couple of examples, our military, our government, different sort of think tanks, if you will, people scientists who gather around and try to design plans and strategies for space shuttle launches, or big term thinking, geoclimate stuff. We get lots of smart people together. You think you would have much success, but oftentimes this negative group think concept kind of rears its ugly head and can throw a wrench in things. And so you'll learn a little bit about what that's all about. Okay, when we get into adversity and happiness, it is a shorter chapter. And we'll talk a little bit first about, it actually kind of touches a little bit on health psychology here, but we'll talk about depression, loneliness, what makes for lonely people, and how do people find happiness? What are people looking for when they're looking for happiness? What goes into that? We'll look at some different physiological and psychological consequences of stress. So again, this is very health psych stuff in here. And then it gets a little bit more into criminal justice, looking at police lineups and trials and prejudice and stereotypes. It's kind of wrapping up a lot of what we've already covered into some very applied aspects of social psych, trying to give you a sense of what that looks like. And then we'll end with some interesting, very fun research on happiness. Here are your article readings, lecture slides. In addition to the Revel videos, I want you to watch the Stanford Prison Study. This is an interesting study looking at groups and roles of individuals within groups and how our roles can change us, and not always in a good way. And this is a very famous study in psychology by Phil Zimbardo, and some of you may have seen it before in other classes. One thing I do want to note, if you're having trouble opening the video, I've put some instructions here for you. You can go ahead and check that out. I have a video on social facilitation and social loafing. Again, those are two concepts covered up in the groups chapter. Here's that video you saw earlier, which combined conformity and groupthink because the two often go together. We talked about the conformity part, and I had you watch the beginning half of the video. You'll want to watch the second half of the video for the groupthink portion and get that there. And then lastly, I have a video on happiness for you. This is comes from research by Dan Goleman and Sonia Lyubomirsky in their lifelong quest to understand what makes people happy. It's a really great video, really interesting research. I worked with Sonia Lyubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside. I worked directly with her. She's a social psychologist and really just dedicated to understanding people in all parts of the world, and what do we share in common when we're looking for happiness, and what's different about us. So that's it for the videos, and then you'll get into your discussion. Again, Articles 25 and 43. Articles 25 has to do with the Stanford Prison Study, so that's really why I want you to watch that video and do the readings before you even attempt to answer this question. Otherwise, you will be in the dark. You have to have seen the study to understand what Zimbardo did and the impact it had and what we learned from it. This was also one of the studies that has been talked about as being unethical. They had to actually stop the study early because of what was happening to the participants in the study. So you're going to be super interested in it, and it's from the 70s, so it's full on 70s music, 70s attire. You should get some laughs from that. Watching that. But so your answer here to factors that contribute to de-individuation should be coming from what you see in the video as well as what you read. I want to see you integrating concepts in to explain that. And then number 43, Article 43 talks a lot about Americans and their leisure time. What do Americans report makes them happy? And you're going to be relating this, to the last chapter that you read on happiness. So I want you citing that last chapter in here as well as citing the article. Tie it all together, okay? So the chapter on adversity and happiness should pop up in your response here, as well as the article research that talks about should pop up in there. And even some stuff from Module 5 that we just finished when you saw America the Rude. That even plays a role here. So it's a good way to kind of tie it all in. And that concludes the discussion. And again, your exam is going to close on Friday. The class ends on Friday. And that is pretty much it. You guys have been a great class. I feel like it went so fast. I'm sure you feel the same way. But again, if you have any questions before the course ends, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, thanks for being a great class, and good luck to everyone who is continuing on in the spring semester.